These are the oldest stories, online at oldeststories.net. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, has now, with great difficulty, enforced his will over a recalcitrant bunch of Syrian kingdoms. Ever since his father had died, Ahumu, lord of Bit Adini, had been making trouble and stirring up anti-Assyrian coalitions. Ahumu, however, has now been defeated, his men decapitated upon the slopes of Mount Sitamret, where Shalmaneser himself, filled with the power of the god Ashur, had waded into the bloody fray. But though Ahumu has been rendered into a slave for public display in the decadent courts of the capital, other nations have been taken a very different lesson from Shalmaneser's struggles to subjugate the Aramaeans and Neo-Hittites. Having secured the empire all the way to the upper Euphrates River and exacted tribute from many lands beyond it, Shalmaneser moves to handle issues in other parts of the empire, allowing the other nations of the Levant to stew in their own thoughts and consider the last few years of battle. No doubt the Assyrians believed that their show of force would do what it always does, cow all the lesser nations into submission. But what it's actually done is show people, first, that the Assyrian Empire can be resisted. Sure, Ahumu came to a bad end eventually, but he was able to unify a bunch of local states and put up a decent fight for a while. Then it also reminds the Levantine peoples that the Assyrians have 4 very busy borders, north, south, east, and west, but only one army and only one military leader. In theory, all you need is a slightly bigger, slightly stronger coalition with deeper reserves to weather the Assyrian storm until one of their other borders starts to get too active and they just give up. In most modern historiography, we say that the man with the plan, the guy that looked at Ahumu's saga and figured that he could do better, was a man named Adad-Idri of Aram. Biblically, this guy is known as Ben-Hadad of Damascus, and more generally he's known as Hadad-Ezer, which is sort of a Hebraization of Adad-Idri, both of which mean the god Adad is my helper. Just one is in Aramaean, the other in Hebrew. But of course, it's far from clear, at least to me, that he actually had a plan in quite those terms. I don't know that he really was emulating Ahumu's resistance. He may well have been, but my guess here is that he's working with the same general toolkit as his Eastern Aramaean cousin had. Now, Ben-Hadad's story isn't known fully. He's been in charge for about a decade or two by the critical year of 853. Prior to him, Damascus was the capital city of a modest-sized Aramaean kingdom, sort of an up-and-coming city just waiting for a great conquering king to make it into a real world capital. Sometimes his land is called Aram, which could be a corruption of Amuru, and this could have been a break-off of the once larger Amuru kingdom. Or it could just signify that his land was an Aramaean kingdom. It certainly wasn't the Aramaean kingdom when he took the throne, a situation he seems to have set out to remedy through a great deal of regional consolidation and conquest. The specifics are unknown, but in general this would have looked a lot like the growth of the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon, a bunch of conquering and a bunch of making friends. By the 850s, Aram Damascus had eclipsed Israel under Ahab as the preeminent land power of the region. But Hamath and Israel are both in close second place, Hamath being just north and west of Damascus, while Israel is just south and west of Damascus. North of Hamath, then, is the border with the lands that have all become subject to Assyria, at least among the major land powers. So there isn't much more room for independent expansion in that direction. Aram Damascus is therefore bounded to the northwest by Hamath, southwest by Israel, south by Israel's sphere of influence. It's bounded to the east by the hard desert that you can't really control in a civilized fashion, and to the northeast by Bit Agusi, which is under Assyrian control. Aram, therefore, has no good direction in which to expand. A war with Israel or Hamath would be costly, as is seen by his biblical wars against wicked King Ahab, and wars against peers are no way to make a nation great. The way to become great was to pick on all the little powers until those former peers now also seem like little powers because you've expanded so much. This, of course, is what Assyria had done, and this is what, at a smaller scale, Israel, Aram, and Hamath are doing. And so, with any further conquest now off the table, the other way to get rich was through peace and trading. So the question exists, how much of what would become the Qarqar coalition was an ad hoc alliance, and how much of it represented connections that had been built between the 12 kingdoms over the preceding years? The military component of it was no doubt pressed into service due to the Assyrian military threat, but economically and diplomatically, it really seems like Ahumu's coalition represented a coherent string of Neo-Assyrian and Aramaean states that had joined together for mutual trade and to advance each other's goals in the fractious region, while Hadad-Ezer's coalition represents a similar grouping down south, just with some more Canaanites involved. Now, this coalition isn't Hadad-Ezer's coalition. We never see him subjugating his near-peer neighbors the way that Assyria subjugated those on their borders. But as the king of the largest state within the interconnected economic and diplomatic network, he would have played an important part in keeping things together. He would have been something more than first among equals, but rather less than a hegemon. In any case, the ties that bound such coalitions would have been quite loose and very personal in nature between the kings themselves. This coalition, however, united a number of important coastal trading cities with a number of important land powers in the Levant. While they don't seem to have been embargoing the Assyrian Empire, having those close ties would have promoted trade between the Levantine kingdoms, as personal connections between merchants and nobles were often as important or more important than raw profitability. Though, of course, profits were always part of the equation as well. It's just that, given the lack of instant communications, you needed those sorts of trade and trust connections, that personal knowledge of who's over there in order to really safeguard your profits. Raw profitability with a bunch of random strangers would just see you get taken advantage of. All this trade, though, was A, diverting at least some wealth that by rights should have been flowing into the Assyrian Empire, and B, having various people existing and gaining in power and prosperity outside the bounds of the empire. Well, this isn't good for the Assyrian point of view. It isn't clear how much Shalmaneser actually saw or officially recognized the existence of such a coalition. The army doesn't typically declare war prior to leaving in the modern sense of, hey, letting everybody know. The army just sort of assembles, the king says, we're going that way, and then that's how the war is going to go. The king would have had an itinerary pre-planned, at least as far as the initial logistics were concerned. We never see what that pre-plan was, though, to compare it with what the army ended up doing after hitting resistance. So we can't really compare the two. That would be fantastic if we could. He planned to go attack these people. What did he actually end up attacking? How far did he end up getting? If we had that, I'd make an episode about it. Anyway, Shalmaneser doesn't come to the west in 853 in order to make war against some unified coalition. He's not planning on having the Battle of Qarqar. Rather, his goal is to ensure his dominion against the North Syrian states that he's just been bullying as of last episodes. And if that goes well, he's probably got it in his head, I'll start picking on some people down in the south. Now for this task, he brings perhaps 40 to 50,000 men. Now this alone is a big deal. It's a massive logistical burden that requires his backlines to be solid. And I really mean that this is a big deal. This is the largest confirmed army that we've seen since the late Bronze Age, and Shalmaneser is bringing it not to contest against some other great power, but to confirm his hold on a fractured region. Having an army this size and not have it be a strain on the nation tells us that Assyria is now large, but also that the food surpluses are quite high at this point. Now, how much of this is climate, how much of this is administrative advances, and how much of this is the widespread distribution of iron tools, it's hard to tell, but all of those are probably factors to some extent. And this isn't even the biggest army that Shalmaneser will muster. He claims at some point in his reign to pull together 120,000 men, a number so high that I'll point out many historians refuse to believe it. And I'll be honest, I also wonder if that 120,000 is not inflated. Perhaps it includes the logistical train, not just soldiers. But the fact that most people think that he's reporting decent estimates for troop numbers at the Battle of Qarqar makes me suspect that Assyria is, in this age, putting campaigns together with what may well hold the title of world's biggest army in history up to this point. World's biggest army means the world's biggest logistical system as well, especially when you are projecting power as far as he is, with grain now being moved all around the empire to storehouses where the army is planning to head. We've seen this being prefigured in the conquests of him and his father in prior years. Given that the army is moving out in the month of Iyar, the second month of the new year, and basically right at the tail end of the harvest season, he's leaving before all the storehouses are actually full, trusting that by the time he arrives, he'll have everything he needs to keep going forward. An ancient army, generally speaking, can carry food for about 10 days of overland travel. And that's an estimate for classical and medieval Europe and China. We don't have strong estimates for the ancient world, so it's possible that the Assyrian army can't even bring 10 days of food with them. Everywhere they go, this walking city is going to just ravage the food stocks like locusts. And the only solution is to simply have more food than even the hungriest of soldiers can eat. Now they march peacefully out from Nineveh in the year 853, the eponymy of Grand Minister Dayan Ashur, heading, as I said, towards those who had opposed Assyria during Ahunu's coalition. First stop are the Aramaean cities of Salalah and Til-Shaturahi, ruled by King Jiamu. Shalmaneser sends a message to those cities that Jiamu, having participated in Ahunu's revolt, would be punished, and those cities should muster up their armies and prepare for some destruction. In response, Jiamu called up the citizens of the city, hoping to inspire them, but the people were so frightened by the impending army, whose size likely surpassed the total population of the towns in question, that the people swarmed their own king, cut off his head, and sent Shalmaneser a letter saying that Jiamu was not their king, only Ashur was their king. So Shalmaneser strolled into town peacefully, set a statue of Ashur in the local palace, and only raided the royal treasury, not the town in general. There was a brief festival which formally celebrated the investiture of the Assyrian god as divine ruler over the city, but informally was probably just a celebration of the survival of the town. All in all, it was a happy ending, unless you were Jiamu himself. From there they reached the Euphrates at Fort Shalmaneser, which had been preparing a stable crossing point for the river even during the flood season. There was no bridge over the Euphrates yet, good luck doing that with mud brick architecture, but likely a fixed on and off point for bringing inflated goatskin rafts across. Only a few years after its capture, and it's already integrated into the imperial logistics network as a fortified granary and river crossing. With 50,000 men crossing the river, he stopped at another city that he'd conquered recently and converted into another logistics hub, and sent out demands to all the kings who had joined in Ahumu's coalition, and without fail, every single one of them sent messages of submission and lavish tribute. Each of these towns would be weak now. The cost of the last few years of defeats would have taken a possibly generational toll on them. Think about Europe after World War I or World War II. That sort of absolute population cave that would have made them struggle to really defend themselves on an ongoing basis after that. And if they had perhaps hoped that Assyria would be similarly bloodied, the appearance of an even larger army this time around seems to have just absolutely broken the former rebels to Shalmaneser's will, at least for a time. And so, with this accomplished, the army started moving slowly south and west, hitting the ancient city of Aleppo, which surrendered immediately upon seeing the army. Now, being an ancient city, it boasted a venerable god, Adad of Halman, and Shalmaneser took the opportunity to make sacrifices before such a storied deity. From there, Assyria needed to make war against Hamath. Now recall from Shalmaneser's father's, Ashurnasirpal's, great westward journey that after he had beaten up the land of Patin, he went a bit out of his way to travel south from there into the land of Luash. Now we still have no idea what Luash had done, but Ashurnasirpal had absolutely flattened the entire land of Luash, despoiling the fields and aggressively depopulating the cities. It seems that Ashurnasirpal had wanted that earth to remain desolate for all eternity. Well, sometime between then and now, Hamath, the Aramaean kingdom which was directly south of Luash, has moved in, overwhelmed what little rulership was left, and sort of took over the area of Luash. In one sense, Hamath is just sort of moving into an abandoned wasteland and, taking what advantage they can. In another sense, they are directly invading Assyrian territory. You can guess which interpretation Shalmaneser is going with here. And this territorial dispute between the desolate wasteland of Luash, between Assyria and Hamath, is the proximate cause of the Battle of Qarqar. From Aleppo, the Assyrian army takes three major cities of Hamath: Adenu, Parga, and Argana. Each was taken quickly with very little resistance, and as such only the palaces and royal properties were despoiled. Heading to the fourth major Hamathite city, Assyria reached the town of Qarqar. This town did put up more resistance, but didn't manage to slow Assyria significantly. But it did manage to earn themselves the punishments due to resistance: a rough plunder and a burning. However, as Assyria was focused on these towns, the Hamathite king and army were already well south of the towns that they had no hope of defending on their own. Instead, they were rendezvousing with Hadad-ezer of Damascus, who himself was calling together the great coalition of 12 kings, most notably Ahab of Israel, Gindabu of the Arabs, and Adunu-Baal of Ushnatu. 10,000 troops also came from the Neo-Hittite region of Urkanata, and smaller numbers came from a number of Phoenician cities like Byblos and Arvad, as well as some Aramaean tribes in the region. There's a debate about whether the Egyptians sent a force as well. 1,000 men came from the land of Mu'usra'ah in support of the coalition. If this was Egypt, and it's very, very similar to the Akkadian name for Egypt, then it wasn't an expedition led by the pharaoh. It would have been a garrison, or perhaps even a private army, led by some lingering Egyptian interest in Canaan, possibly without even the pharaoh's express permission. Otherwise, it could be some obscure kingdom in the region whose name might be somewhat similar in Akkadian, and which has been, mostly forgotten to obscurity. We don't know enough about their involvement either way for the debate to matter too much, but it is a interesting, lingering question in the scholarship. Now, just the top four coalition members, Damascus, Hamath, Urkanata, and Israel, are reported as bringing 50,000 men together. Add in the others, plus estimates where the text is unclear, and all 12 kings seem to have brought close to 60,000 men altogether. Now, Shalmaneser's famous Kirk Stela, our best source for the battle, details infantry, cavalry, chariotry, and camelry figures for each king. And the sheer scale of it is rather shocking. There is a lingering question of how accurate these numbers were, and how many people were actually at the battle, given how many are being claimed here. I have been saying that Shalmaneser probably had somewhere around 50,000 men in total, though I would put extremely high error bars around that figure. The Assyrians don't directly report their numbers in this battle, so the safe assumption is that whatever you think about the enemy forces, the Assyrian army was probably within 10 to 15,000 of that, higher or lower, plus or minus a bit. As to the coalition force numbers, it's hard for me to not take them seriously. All of them are nice round numbers, and of course they're being reported by the coalition's enemies, so I don't think that anyone expects them to be anything more than estimates, probably based on after the battle reporting, and there is a good chance that these estimates are somewhat inflated, or at least generally rounded up to make the enemy army seem larger than it actually was. However, there is beyond this a fair number of people who claim that these numbers are simply fabricated, vastly out of proportion to what was possible at the time. And I think this is mistaken. There are some who argue, especially with Israel, that Israel must have been a tiny, powerless nation. Now, these are usually biblical minimalists, arguing that we haven't found enough royal stables to account for the supposed 2,000 chariots that Ahab is thought to have brought to this battle. Now, it should be pretty clear why this isn't a very good line of reasoning. To expect to find all the royal stables from this one point and place in history is in a very difficult archaeological region. It's a little bit silly. Also common, although also not very good, is the idea held by many that ancient records always exaggerated the size of enemy armies. This idea comes from the Greek and Roman historians, who often did exactly that, to make favored factions seem more skilled in battle, and to make great defeats seem more reasonable. However, there simply isn't a track record of this sort of distortion in Mesopotamia. The ancient scribes were, first and foremost, accountants. We simply don't have a track record of them getting numbers wrong in a consistent way like that. It is possible that they could have, but we don't have reason to think they were doing it in Shalmaneser's time in general. Later in his life, we're going to see another number that many claim is inflated. At some point, he'll claim to have fielded once a total of 120,000 men in his army, and this number strains credibility even harder than the numbers at Qarqar. But even here, there are differences. The count at Qarqar is very detailed and highly contextualized, the sort of administrative listing that most ancient historians reckon was quite accurate in nearly all other ancient documents. And the behavior of the northern states on this campaign, their capitulation after so many years of resistance, suggests to me that the Assyrians really did bring a remarkably large army. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that we really need to posit that Shalmaneser was doing something very differently from what his father had been doing. While his father had led mostly a professional corps tirelessly and ruthlessly, Shalmaneser, who lacked that same hard-nosed edge, is relying on the massive economy of Assyria to overwhelm his opponents with numbers. This isn't pure human wave tactics. His professional corps is still extremely tough, and there's no reason to think he was leaving huge piles of friendly corpses behind, but he was just more content to put someone in an unwinnable circumstance through sheer weight of numbers, rather than terrifying them about the price of resistance and failure. Of course, bringing the largest possible hammer has its own costs. There's less strategic flexibility when so much has to be invested in any given campaign, and it imposes costs on the empire which could potentially detract from wealth going elsewhere. But in an Assyrian context, this doesn't actually matter all that much. There's only ever one army, and it goes out basically once a year, rain or shine, so there isn't so much space for strategic flexibility in that regard. And the Assyrian king is not a great landowner, unlike some other kings. State funds don't typically go into economic improvements because the king doesn't directly benefit from economic improvements, and he probably doesn't have the sort of mindset for investing. The king does have some lands, of course. He does have a fair amount of personal wealth and investments, but the Assyrian king profits from war, one campaign a year. So as long as more troops gets him more final profit, keeping in mind that he isn't actually the one feeding all these troops, just his subjects do all the logistical work, then there's no reason for him not to bring 50 or 100,000 men with him, so long as they can all be fed and they get to their destination successfully. Anyway, there's a lot of details around the Battle of Qarqar that make it famous. It's the first confirmed use of cavalry and camelry in battle, though we have seen logistical evidence of earlier cavalry, so we're pretty sure it isn't the first actual cavalry battle. It's also the first certain extra-biblical mention in history of the Kingdom of Israel, and the first certain mention in all of history of the Arabs. But again, there's enough to be fairly certain that both existed before the battle as well. It is a key event in the saga of Damascus, which we will continue to cover. But most importantly, we can see Assyria being overwhelmingly dominant now, requiring basically every notable power in the region to even hope to fight them off. The real significance of Qarqar is that the whole Near East has now recovered from the Bronze Age collapse so completely as to field armies that would have fared well against the great empires of 400 years ago. The battle itself, however, was an absolute slog. 14,000 coalition soldiers were estimated as dead, and likely something not too far distant from that is the count of Assyrian dead, anywhere from 10 to 30% casualty rates depending on where all of your estimates fall out. The king, of course, claims victory, but that's far from certain here. The campaign halts for the year. The king instead opts to finish with a visit to the Mediterranean Sea, and could, by some measures, have a claim to have succeeded pretty well overall through the summer. But did Shalmaneser choose to stop expending so much effort on the south because, he couldn't be bothered with it? Or was he actually prevented by defeat from continuing the campaign? In a sense, the strategic situation is such that Assyria doesn't need to strain to desperately assault into the teeth of the enemy army and enemy fortifications over and over again in the same campaign. They can and will return again and again and again until the people of the Levant are ground into dust, or until the Assyrian Empire gets, distracted by other priorities. But the Assyrian Empire does get distracted in the aftermath of the Battle of Qarqar. The next year saw a rebellion in the north that needed to be put down, and the 2 years after that were his famous tour in Babylonia. So we have to ask, if Shalmaneser had lost in the west, would he not have needed to return the following year to save face? It's hard to think that the opposite could be the case, that the coalition was so strong that he didn't dare return, because in the 4th year after Qarqar, he did return. And until we find more detailed accounts of these later Western expeditions, we're going to be left with short annals accounts from which we can say significantly less. But there is still a tale to tell here. So, in 849, Carchemish had not seen the Assyrian army in a few years, and has decided to just, stop paying tribute, making them the target of the year, now that the situation in Babylonia has settled down. A large army is raised to correct Carchemish's attitude problem, and a bunch of the cities in the Carchemish region are destroyed, though probably not Carchemish itself. And the Assyrians carry their punitive expedition into the minor towns of Aramu also. In all this, however, it seems that Hadad-ezer had been planning something. Perhaps he had been expanding his sphere of influence, which is what had incentivized Carchemish and Aramu to go rogue, in an attempt to assemble an even larger coalition. And, just like last time, the United Kings take a bit longer than the Assyrians to come together. So it's only after Shalmaneser has supposedly raised 100 towns in the region that a coalition of kings, quote, from the shore of the sea, were able to come upon the Assyrian army in battle. In this engagement, it seems pretty clear that the Assyrians didn't actually win. Now, the question of victory and defeat is quite debatable around Qarqar, but here the telling feature is that the king doesn't claim to have taken any significant plunder home at all, nor even having killed any particular amount of enemy, just claiming that at some point, the enemy ran away, at which point the king ended his campaign for the year. Of course, the official record calls this a win, but the next year the king is forced to attack the exact same cities in the exact same nations, Carchemish and Aramu. This time the king is able to secure a battlefield victory, again with massive implied armies, though smaller than Qarqar. Because of his victory, he's able to pillage a city of Aramu and get submission from Kalpuranda, which is a Neo-Hittite statelet, and able to pull down Sublemete's cedars on his way home as well, just to make sure that everybody knows that he did in fact win here. Still, even though this last one was a victory, it was a limited one. All of which raises the question of just who is this Hadad-ezer and what is up with Damascus? To me, it looks like it's a nation that's rising in just the same way that Assyria was rising 100 years ago. It isn't an exact mirror of the earlier Assyrians, of course, but it had the resources and vigorous king needed to start putting its will out upon the world. The biggest difference seems to be that it's surrounded by kingdoms that, while not quite Damascus's equal, are tougher than the ones that surrounded Assyria at the end of the collapse years. It can't quite be the bully that Assyria was, but it has built something with real potential in its network of alliances. Damascus is a seed that has started to sprout, and is now enduring unexpectedly harsh outside conditions, shaping its development into something very different from how Assyria grew. Which, again reflects on Israel. If Damascus is a state that could have, in the absence of Assyria, and assuming a few generations of stable competence, built itself into a regional great power, and if Israel is a near peer to Damascus, easily among the top 3 nations in the Levant in this generation, then the powerful but limited character of the kingdom in the biblical text seems to match pretty well what we're seeing in these campaigns. In 847, then, Shalmaneser returns, but he doesn't challenge the southern coalition. Instead, he heads west and then north, up into Anatolia to bully some mountain folk. The next year is another northern push, likely with much smaller numbers, to bully a small mountain people, showing that even the mighty Assyrian economy can't sustain tens of thousands strong armies for multiple consecutive years without at least a bit of a rest. But in 845, we get what seems to have been a pivotal event about which we have frustratingly few details. In this year, Shalmaneser seems determined to end the stalemate between himself and Damascus. This is the year he famously claims to have brought 120,000 men with him to war. He does make this claim on multiple different records, but each of these multiple different records seems to be copies of each other. We've only got this one annal and an even briefer summary to work from here, so you can be skeptical of his number here or not. We've basically got nothing to judge it by. So all we can really say is that this is Shalmaneser's largest army, brought an extreme distance to the very edge of his logistical tether, to finally put an end to the Damascene threat once and for all. And what happens? Hadad-ezer scrapes every last peasant and tribal together out of his and his allied lands, and he somehow manages to put together an army even larger. Though they do have the advantage of home turf and logistics here, and he is able to use the difficult terrain of Canaan to stop the Assyrian army in its tracks. The largest army that the world has ever seen at this point, almost certainly, even if it's not 120,000, the range of possible numbers does very well include the largest army the world has ever seen. And it stopped in its tracks in a battle that we don't even know where it was fought. Shalmaneser returns home, and he never again fights Hadad-ezer, who has now successfully repulsed 5 Assyrian campaigns, either through outright victory or enough of a resistance to prevent a proper regional conquest. The cost of all this, however, must have been absolutely crushing, both for Damascus and its allies. We know almost nothing about Aramaean internal politics, but shortly after this battle, Hadad-ezer dies. The biblical account suggests to us that Damascus was actually too strong and starting to become a threat to Israel, so God sent the prophet Elijah over that way, where he anointed a man named Hazael to take over, perhaps knowing that this would lead ultimately to the downfall of the entire region. But you know, God's plans always work out for the best. In 841, Shalmaneser returns, not with 120,000 men, but with a force likely near in strength to what he brought to Qarqar, plus or minus, a little bit. There, he did not get distracted attacking other settlements along the way. He headed straight for Damascus. Hazael, meanwhile, is not Hadad-ezer. He is a usurper, and he has not been able to reform the coalition of his predecessor. The coalition that Assyria could not shatter was destroyed through internal politicking and perhaps by the will of God. But that is also the strength of Assyria, to batter at the enemy year upon year upon year upon year until they are exhausted, while the empire endures. The two armies fight at a fortified mountain near Mount Lebanon, and Hazael, standing alone, is drowned in a tide of Assyrian warriors. The usurper himself retreats to behind the walls of Damascus, which he is able to hold on to, but he gets shut up in the capital while the Assyrian army absolutely devastates the surrounding lands. Victory is finally secured, and so the Assyrian army marches to Tyre in force, the greatest of the Phoenician coastal trading cities, and erects a statue of the king. Before the statue is finished, Tyre submits. Knowing that Israel is next, Jehu of the northern Israel also offers his submission. Finally, halfway through his reign, Shalmaneser achieves the goal he had hoped to reach in his inaugural campaign: the complete submission of the entire Levant, or at least all the significant powers in the region. He would still head west later in life, but it would be into Anatolia to conquer the distant mountain peoples in an effort to match the reach of Sargon of Akkad, campaigns made possible by his securing of the Mediterranean Sea region. Next time, however, we won't be heading west, but instead south and a bit back in time to learn a bit about what has been going on down in Babylon. Turns out that for all the general public often confuses Assyria and Babylon, the two Akkadian civilizations are extremely different in their approach to the world, and the current Babylonian unrest highlights this extremely well. So join us next time for a political treatise, a foreign intervention, and a thrilling chase down in Babylonia. Thank you for listening.